CEO falls for contract wife, asks for kisses every day, making everyone jealous. But one day she vanished without a trace, leaving him in tears. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Proverbs 12:25 reminds us, anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up. Let us pray. Lord, when anxiety weighs down my heart, may your word fill me with delight, joy, and peace. Restore my strength and comfort my heart with your love and kindness. Amen. Today, I won't talk too much, as I've realized that extra words might make some of my loyal family feel disconnected. I value you deeply, and I promise to let this story speak for itself. I am confident it will touch your heart and soul. But before we dive in, tell me, how was the last story? Did it resonate with you? Let me know in the comments, because your feedback helps me grow and create stories that truly matter to you. Now, let's begin today's story. Chapter 1. The Contract. Winter Aled stood before the glass doors of Owen Enterprises, her heart a thundering drum against her ribs. The morning sun caught the subtle gold undertones in her dark skin, highlighting the quiet determination in her stance. Her simple navy dress, the nicest she owned, felt inadequate against the backdrop of corporate luxury, but she lifted her chin with inherited grace. The manila envelope in her vintage leather bag held more than just an application. It held her brother's chance at survival. Last night's hospital visit flashed through her mind, Gethin's thin face animated despite his weakness, trying to talk her out of this. "You can't sell yourself for me, Win," he'd whispered. But they both knew there were no other options left. The experimental treatment's success rate was remarkable, but its price tag might as well have been written in stars. The security guard, an older man named Iwan, gave her a gentle smile as she passed. He'd been kind during the preliminary screenings, noticing how different she was from the parade of socialites and models who'd arrived in chauffeur-driven cars, wearing outfits that cost more than her yearly rent. Inside, the elevator carried her to the 50th floor, each soft ding marking her ascent into a world she'd never imagined entering. The contract marriage program had made headlines when Michael Owen announced it, a chance for the billionaire to find a suitable wife while providing life-changing funds to the chosen candidate. Winter touched the silver locket at her throat, drawing strength from the photos of her parents inside. "Guide me," she whispered to their memory. The reception area was bigger than her entire apartment, decorated with artwork that probably cost more than Gethin's entire treatment plan. The receptionist, Alwyn, gave her a practiced smile that held a hint of pity. "Mr. Owen will see you now. You're his last appointment." Michael Owen stood at his window when she entered, his tall frame silhouetted against the city skyline. When he turned, something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. He was handsome in a way that spoke of careful cultivation, every dark hair perfectly placed, his suit probably worth more than her car. "Miss Aled," he said, his voice carrying wealth in every syllable, "you're my last appointment of the day." "Mr. Owen." Winter met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his perfectly tailored appearance or the obvious power he wielded. In the sunlight streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows, she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath his polished exterior, a loneliness that matched her own. He picked up her file, scanning it with practiced efficiency. "Your application is unusual. No attempts to flatter me. No elaborate stories about following my career, just straight facts." His eyes found hers again, curiosity evident in his expression. "Most candidates try to convince me they've been secretly in love with me for years." "I don't believe in lying," Winter replied simply. "Not even for $5 million. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. He moved around his desk, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Even when the truth might cost you everything?" "Especially then." Winter's voice carried the strength her mother had always praised, gentle but unshakable. My parents taught me that truth is all we really have in this world. Everything else can be taken away. Something shifted in Michael's expression at the mention of parents. He'd done his research, knew about the drunk driver, the rainy Tuesday evening that had left Winter and Gethin alone in the world. But seeing the quiet grace with which she carried that loss stirred something in him. "Tell me about your brother," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the request. Winter's composure softened slightly at the mention of Gethin. "He's 19, brilliant, accepted to 3 Ivy League schools before he got sick." She swallowed hard, pushing back emotion. "The experimental treatment he needs isn't covered by insurance. We lost our parents 5 years ago, so it's just us. I've worked 3 jobs, sold everything of value we owned. He's all I have left." Michael found himself moving closer, drawn by the quiet strength in her voice. For the first time in years, someone in his office was speaking to him as a person, not a prize to be won or a power to be courted. "And you're willing to marry a complete stranger to save him?" "I'm willing to do anything to save him," Winter corrected, her dark eyes meeting his with unflinching honesty. "The question is whether you're willing to choose someone who won't pretend to worship you." For the first time in years, Michael Owen felt something stir in his carefully controlled heart. This woman, with her simple dress and complicated truth, had cut through all his defenses with a single conversation. "Most people in this office are afraid to speak to me so directly," he observed, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "I'm not most people, Mr. Owen, and I'm not afraid of you." Winter tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I think perhaps you're more afraid of yourself." The observation hit closer to home than he cared to admit. Their eyes met across the expensive carpet, and something electric passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits hidden beneath their vastly different exteriors. "The contract," Michael said finally, pressing a button on his phone. When Alwyn brought in the leather portfolio, he found himself watching Winter's reactions carefully. She read every page thoroughly, asking intelligent questions about terms and conditions. No one had ever approached this transaction with such careful dignity before. As Winter signed her name with steady hands, Michael found himself studying her profile, the elegant line of her neck, the quiet grace in her movements. This wasn't how he'd expected his search to end, but something told him this woman, this honest, brave woman, would change his life in ways no contract could anticipate. "Welcome to my world, Miss Allard," he said softly as she rose to leave. The words carried more weight than he'd intended, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Winter turned at the door, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. "I hope your world is ready for someone real, Mr. Owen." Her words lingered in the air long after she'd gone, along with the subtle scent of her perfume, something simple and honest, like everything else about her. Michael touched the contract where she had signed, feeling the slight indentation of her name. For the first time since announcing this program, he felt something beyond business interest, a spark of genuine connection that both thrilled and terrified him. That evening, as Winter sat beside Gethin's hospital bed sharing the news, and Michael stood in his penthouse holding a glass of untouched scotch, neither could know how their lives had truly changed. Not because of the contract they'd signed, but because of the truth they'd recognized in each other's eyes. A truth that would eventually tear them apart and bring them back together, stronger and more real than either had dreamed possible. Their story had begun, not with the flourish of a pen on legal papers, but with a moment of genuine connection in a world built on facades, and somewhere in the city night, destiny smiled at what was to come. Chapter 2. The Agreement. The rain painted silver streaks down the windows of Owen Enterprises, turning the city into a watercolor of greys and muted lights. Winter sat in Michael's office for the second time, exactly 1 week after their first meeting. Everything about this moment felt weighted with significance. The heavy leather portfolio containing their final contract, the silence broken only by distant thunder, the way Michael stood by the window with his suit jacket off and sleeves rolled up, showing the first crack in his perfect facade. "The PR team has prepared a complete narrative," he said, not turning from the window. His reflection ghosted against the stormy backdrop, and Winter caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his expression. "They want to position this as a fairy tale romance, the successful businessman who fell for the beautiful girl from a modest background." "And what do you want, Mr. Owen?" Winter's fingers found her mother's locket, drawing strength from its familiar contours. Michael turned then, and something in his carefully controlled expression shifted. "What I want hasn't mattered for a very long time." He moved to his desk, lifting a crystal tumbler of amber liquid but not drinking. "This is business." "Is it?" Winter stood, drawn to the window beside him. "Tell me something, Mr. Owen. Why did you choose me? The truth this time." Their eyes met in the window's reflection. "Because you're the only one who didn't try to sell me a fantasy," he admitted softly. "You came here with truth, even knowing it might cost you everything." Winter studied his profile, seeing past the polished exterior to something vulnerable beneath. "Your father taught you that truth was dangerous, didn't he?" Michael's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing. She knew she was treading dangerous ground. Her research had revealed the scandal of his childhood, how his father had abandoned the family for a young artist, leaving Michael and his mother to rebuild from betrayal's ashes. "You've done your homework," he said tightly. "As have you." Winter turned to face him fully. "You know about my parents' accident, about working 3 jobs through college, about selling everything to help Gethin, about the community art classes I taught until his condition worsened." A muscle ticked in Michael's jaw. The background check was thorough. "Then you know exactly who you're getting, Mr. Owen. No pretenses, no fairy tales, just a woman who will do anything to save her brother." The contract lay between them on his desk, its pages heavy with implications. Michael opened it carefully, each movement precise. $5 million transferred immediately for your brother's treatment. Joint accounts for maintaining appropriate appearances. Use of all properties and vehicles." He paused, watching her carefully. "The contract term is 2 years. After that, an amicable divorce and an additional $3 million settlement." "Assuming I play my part perfectly," Winter added quietly. "Yes." Michael's fingers drummed once on the leather folder, the only tell of nervous energy he'd shown. "There's also the matter of physical expectations." Heat rose in Winter's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I read the preliminary contract. I understand what's required." "Michael," he said suddenly. "What?" "If we're going to be married, even for show, you should call me Michael." He spread the documents with careful precision. "At least in private." Winter watched his hands move across the papers, noting how they trembled slightly despite their manicured appearance. This man, who controlled vast business empires and moved millions with a signature, was nervous about their contract marriage. "Why me?" she asked again. "The truth, Michael, not what you tell the board or the PR team." He looked up, and for a moment his carefully constructed facade cracked completely. "Because when you look at me, you see past all of this." He gestured to his office, his expensive suit, all the trappings of his power. "You see something real, and that terrifies me as much as it draws me in." The admission hung between them, delicate as spider silk and just as fragile. Thunder rolled outside, nature's punctuation to his moment of honesty. "I need to see my brother," Winter said softly, "before we sign. One last time as just his sister, not Mrs. Michael Owen." Something softened in Michael's expression. Without a word, he pressed a button on his phone. "Bring the car around," he ordered, "and clear my afternoon." The drive to the hospital was quiet, the rain creating a cocoon of privacy in the luxury car's interior. Winter felt Michael watching her as she stared out the window, his gaze carrying questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. Gethin was awake when they arrived, his thin face lighting up at the sight of his sister. "Win!" Then he noticed Michael, and his smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Owen." "Please," Michael said, surprising both siblings with the gentleness in his tone. "Call me Michael. We're going to be family after all." Winter touched her brother's hand, noting how fragile it felt in hers. "The contracts are ready," she said softly. "The treatment can begin immediately after the signing." "Win, you don't have to," Gethin began, but she squeezed his hand. "Yes, I do. You're all I have left of our family. I'd do anything for you." Michael stood slightly apart, watching the siblings with an expression Winter couldn't quite read. When Gethin's nurse came in to check his vitals, Michael stepped closer to the bed. "The treatment has a 90% success rate," he said quietly. "I've had my medical team review everything. They'll oversee your care personally." Gethin studied the billionaire carefully. "Why are you really doing this? What do you get out of marrying my sister?" "Gethin," Winter protested, but Michael held up a hand. "It's a fair question." He met Gethin's gaze steadily. "The truth, I don't know anymore. I started this program for business reasons, public image, board pressure, social expectations. But your sister—" He glanced at Winter, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "She makes me want to be more than a collection of business decisions." The honesty in his voice surprised them all. Gethin's expression softened slightly. "Just don't hurt her," he said finally. "She's been through enough." Back in Michael's office, the contract waited. Winter read every page carefully, asking questions about unclear clauses, noting the precise requirements for their public life together. When they reached the section about physical intimacy, she forced herself to read it as clinically as possible. "We'll need to be convincing," Michael said softly. "The media will be watching closely." Winter nodded, signing her initials at the bottom of the page. "I understand. The wedding will be in 2 weeks," he continued. "My PR team will handle everything. They're already crafting our love story." 2 weeks? Winter looked up, startled. "That's very quick." "Time is crucial for Gethin's treatment," Michael reminded her. Then more quietly, "And the board is pushing for this to happen before the next shareholders' meeting." "Of course. Business first." Winter signed another page, her signature flowing across the expensive paper. But when she reached for the final page, Michael caught her hand. "Wait," he said softly. "Before you sign this last page, I need you to know something." Winter looked up, caught by the intensity in his gaze. "This started as business," he continued, still holding her hand. "But something changed the moment you walked into my office with your honest eyes and uncompromising truth. I don't know what this is becoming, but—" He took a deep breath. "I promise to try to be worthy of your honesty." Winter felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected sincerity in his voice. "And I promise," she whispered, "to help you remember how to be real." The final signature felt heavier than the others, more permanent somehow. As Winter set down the pen, Michael did something completely unexpected. He reached out and touched her locket gently. "Tell me about them," he said softly. "Your parents. Not what's in the files. Tell me who they really were." And there, as rain painted the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, Winter began to share the real story of her family with the man who would become her husband. Neither of them could know it then, but this moment of genuine connection would prove stronger than any contract they'd just signed. Their agreement was sealed not just in ink and legal terms, but in the first tentative steps towards something neither had expected to find: a chance at genuine love in a world built on appearances. Chapter 3. The Wedding. The bridal suite of the Grand Plaza Hotel was larger than Winter's entire apartment. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across racks of designer dresses and tables laden with makeup and hair products. 2 weeks had passed in a whirlwind of preparations, and now the day had arrived, her wedding day. Winter stood before a triple mirror, barely recognizing herself. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of French couture, its price tag more than she'd earned in the past 5 years combined. Layers of silk and delicate lace hugged her curves before flowing into a cathedral train, crystals catching the light with every movement. Her dark skin glowed against the pristine white, and her natural hair had been styled into an elegant updo with a diamond-studded tiara that probably cost more than a small house. "You look absolutely perfect," gushed Alwyn, who had somehow transformed from Michael's cool receptionist into an enthusiastic wedding coordinator. "The press will go crazy for this. It's exactly the fairy tale they want to see." Winter touched her mother's silver locket, now nestled beneath layers of expensive fabric. It was the only piece of her real life she'd been allowed to wear. Everything else had been carefully selected by Michael's PR team to craft the perfect image. 5 minutes until the photography team arrives," announced Carwin, one of the PR specialists, checking her tablet. "Remember, Winter, soft smiles, dreamy looks, like you can't believe your luck in marrying Michael Owen." "I think she can manage that without coaching," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Gethin sat in his wheelchair, looking better than he had in months. The first round of treatment had already begun to show results, bringing colour back to his cheeks and strength to his voice. Winter turned to her brother, careful of the dress's delicate train. "You should be resting," she chided gently, "and miss seeing my sister become Mrs. Michael Owen. Not a chance." Gethin wheeled closer, his hospital bracelet incongruous against his custom-tailored suit. "Mam and Dad would be so proud of you, Win." "Would they?" Winter whispered, low enough that only Gethin could hear. "Proud that I'm marrying for money." "Proud that you're willing to do anything to save your family," Gethin corrected firmly, "just like they taught us." A knock at the door interrupted them. The photography team swarmed in, led by a famous fashion photographer who'd shot for Vogue, and now commanded prices that could feed a small country. Winter straightened her spine, remembering all the coaching sessions on how to pose, how to smile, how to look like a woman madly in love. The next hour passed in a blur of camera flashes and directions. "Chin up slightly, turn to the left. Think about your first kiss with Michael." "Perfect." Winter followed every instruction mechanically, playing her part in this elaborate production. Meanwhile, in another suite of the hotel, Michael Owen stood at a window, looking out over the city he'd helped shape. His bespoke tuxedo, hand-tailored in Italy, fit him perfectly. Every detail of his appearance had been crafted for maximum impact. The precise trim of his hair, the subtle cologne, the platinum cufflinks engraved with his family crest. "The guests are arriving," reported Harry, his head of security. "Every major news outlet is represented. Social media is already buzzing with speculation about the dress." Michael nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. He'd spent the morning in meetings with his board of directors, reassuring them about the marriage's positive impact on company image and stock prices. Everything was proceeding according to plan, so why did he feel so unsettled? The door opened again, admitting his mother, Eleanor Owen. She was the picture of aristocratic elegance in a designer suit that perfectly matched her silver hair. "Darling," she said, crossing the room to adjust his already perfect tie. "Are you certain about this?" "The board approves," Michael replied automatically. "The PR team says it's perfect timing with the new Asian expansion." "That's not what I asked." Eleanor's fingers stilled on his tie. "This girl, Winter, she's different from your usual circle." Michael met his mother's concerned gaze in the mirror. "That's precisely why I chose her." "Because she's honest?" Eleanor's tone was knowing. "Or because she's as damaged by her past as you are by yours?" "Mother, I've seen how you look at her, Michael. When you think no one's watching, this may have started as a business arrangement, but be careful. Hearts don't always follow contracts." Before Michael could respond, Owain, his PR director, burst in. "It's time. Everyone's in position. Are you ready?" The Grand Plaza's ballroom had been transformed into a fantasy of white flowers and crystal lights. 500 guests filled the gilded chairs. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities, all carefully selected for maximum media impact. Television cameras lined the back wall, broadcasting live to millions of viewers who'd been captivated by the whirlwind romance of Michael Owen and his mysterious bride. Winter stood at the entrance, her heart thundering beneath layers of silk and lace. The music began, not the traditional wedding march, but a string quartet's arrangement of La Vie en Rose, part of the carefully crafted French romance theme. "Ready?" Gethin asked softly. He'd insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle beside her, refusing a helper. "You can still run." Winter squeezed his shoulder gently. "No running," she whispered. "We're Alids. We face things head-on." The doors opened. Hundreds of faces turned to watch her entrance, cameras flashing like stars. Winter forced herself to smile, to walk with the grace she'd practiced for countless hours. She kept her eyes fixed on Michael, standing at the altar in his perfect tuxedo, playing his role just as carefully as she played hers. But when their eyes met, something shifted. For a moment the cameras disappeared, the watching crowd faded away, and Winter saw something real flash across Michael's face, a glimpse of the man behind the billionaire mask, a hint of vulnerability that matched her own. The ceremony passed in a haze of practiced words and choreographed movements. They exchanged rings, platinum for him, diamond encrusted for her, both custom-designed and worth small fortunes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Michael's kiss was perfect for the cameras, passionate enough to seem real, controlled enough to remain elegant. Yet his hand trembled slightly against her waist, and Winter felt his heart racing where their bodies touched. This wasn't in the contract, this moment of shared uncertainty, this flash of genuine connection. The reception was a showcase of wealth and influence. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light like liquid diamonds, while Michelin-starred chefs presented course after course of culinary artistry. Winter danced with Michael, both of them following the steps they'd practiced, smiling for the photographers who circled like elegant vultures. "You look beautiful," Michael murmured during their first dance, his words masked by the music. "The dress cost enough," Winter replied softly. "I wasn't talking about the dress." Before she could respond, they were swept into the endless social obligations of the evening. Winter played her part, perfectly, laughing at the right moments, touching Michael's arm with practiced affection, charming his business associates with her natural grace, carefully coached over hours of etiquette training. Late in the evening, she found a moment alone on a balcony, breathing in the night air. The city stretched below, a tapestry of lights and shadows. Her new life. "Hiding from our guests?" Michael's voice came from behind her. "Taking a moment to remember who I am," Winter corrected, not turning around, "before I disappear completely into this fantasy we've created." She felt him move closer, his presence warm in the cool night air. "And who are you, Winter Owen?" The new name sent a shiver through her. "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then, surprising her, he reached out and touched her locket. "Your parents?" Winter nodded, her throat tight. "Keep this part of yourself," he said softly. "No matter what happens in there, no matter what the contract says, keep your truth." Before Winter could respond, Carwin appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Owen, the governor is asking for you. And Winter, darling, the cake cutting is in 10 minutes. The moment shattered like crystal. Michael's face smoothed back into its public mask, and Winter straightened her spine, ready to play her role again. But as they walked back into the reception, his hand found the small of her back, steadying her. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of cake and champagne, dancing and photographs, carefully orchestrated moments for the press to capture. When they finally left, rice and rose petals raining down around them, the waiting Rolls-Royce whisked them away to Michael's penthouse, their home now according to the contract. In the elevator, surrounded by mirrors that reflected them infinitely, Winter caught Michael watching her. "Having second thoughts?" she asked quietly. "About the contract?" "No." His voice was equally soft. "About other things, maybe." The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, a space of marble and glass, with views that made Winter's heart stop. But it was the small detail that caught her eye first. A framed photo of her parents, placed carefully on a side table. "I had it restored from the digital copy in your file," Michael said, watching her reaction. "I thought, you should have something of them here." Winter touched the frame gently, emotion tightening her throat. It was such an unexpectedly thoughtful gesture from a man who supposedly cared only about business. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael loosened his tie, some of his rigid control falling away now that they were alone. "Your brother's first treatment went well today. The doctors are optimistic." "Yes." Winter turned to him, really looking at him for the first time since the ceremony. "Thank you for that too, for everything." Something passed between them then, something neither of them was ready to name. Michael took a step closer, then stopped himself. "You must be tired. Your room is through there, the blue suite. Everything you need should be unpacked already." Winter nodded, understanding his retreat. This was safer, keeping to the contract's clear lines, but as she turned toward her room, he spoke again. "Winter." She paused, looking back at him. "Welcome home." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities neither of them had anticipated. Winter smiled slightly, a real smile this time, not the one she'd practiced for the cameras. "Good night, Michael." In her new room, surrounded by more luxury than she'd ever imagined, Winter finally let her carefully maintained composure crack. She sat at the vanity, slowly removing the diamonds from her hair, wiping away the professional makeup, unzipping the couture dress. Under everything, her mother's locket still rested against her heart. She opened it, looking at the smiling faces of her parents. "I hope you understand," she whispered to their photos. "I hope you know I'm trying to do the right thing." But as she got ready for bed in this strange new place, Winter couldn't shake the feeling that the right thing was becoming more complicated by the moment. And Michael Owen, she was beginning to realize, was far more complex than the cold businessman she'd agreed to marry. The contract had been signed, the show performed perfectly. But something else had begun that day, something unplanned and potentially dangerous. Something real. Chapter 4. The first night dawn crept over the city skyline as Winter stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse's main living room. Her first morning as Mrs. Michael Owen. The thought felt strange, like a coat that didn't quite fit. She'd woken early, unable to sleep in the massive bed with its silk sheets and cloud-soft mattress, everything too perfect, too foreign. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Michael emerged from his room, already, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his tie a subtle shade of blue that probably cost more than a month's rent at her old apartment. He paused when he saw her, something flickering in his eyes before his usual mask of control settled into place. "You're up early," he said, his voice softer than usual in the quiet morning light. Winter gestured to the sunrise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Couldn't miss this view." "Ah." Michael moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain a professional distance. "The view was what sold me on this place. That and the privacy. No other buildings can see in." "Always thinking of image control," Winter observed, but there was no bite in her words. Michael's reflection in the window showed a brief smile. "Always." He hesitated, then added, "I had something prepared for you. For last night, actually, but you seemed tired after the reception." Winter turned to him, curious. Michael Owen wasn't known for spontaneous gestures that weren't calculated for public consumption. He led her to the other side of the penthouse, to a set of double doors she hadn't noticed the night before. "Close your eyes," he said, and something in his tone made her comply without question. She heard the doors open, felt him guide her forward with a gentle hand at her elbow. The air changed, becoming warmer, filled with a familiar scent she couldn't quite place. "Now look." Winter opened her eyes and gasped. The room before her had been transformed into a scene from an old movie. Soft lighting came from vintage crystal chandeliers, casting a warm glow over furnishings that could have come straight from the 1950s. A record player in the corner played Ella Fitzgerald's "Dream a Little Dream of Me" on vinyl, the sound rich and authentic. Rose petals were scattered across antique linen-covered surfaces, and candles flickered in Art Deco holders. "You mentioned loving old films," Michael said quietly from behind her, "especially the romance and elegance of the 1950s. I thought, for our first night as husband and wife, even if it's just for show, you deserved something special, something real." Winter turned to him, truly surprised for the first time since this arrangement began. "You remembered that? I only mentioned it once during the contract negotiations." "I listen," Michael replied simply, "even when I pretend not to." He stepped further into the room, his modern suit incongruous against the vintage setting. "I had everything sourced authentically, the furniture, the record player, even the champagne glasses." He gestured to a small bar cart that looked like it belonged in Casablanca. "The only modern touches are the roses. I wasn't sure if you had allergies." Winter moved through the space, touching things gently, the silky, smooth wood of a side table, the delicate lace of a tablecloth, the cool crystal of a champagne flute. "This must have taken weeks to arrange." "The moment you mentioned loving old films, actually." Michael looked almost embarrassed. "I may have gotten carried away with the details." "Why?" Winter asked, turning to face him. "This isn't for the press. No cameras, no audience. It's not part of the contract." Michael was quiet for a long moment, the candlelight softening his usually sharp features. "Perhaps I wanted one real thing in this arrangement. One moment that wasn't calculated for public consumption or shareholder approval." The record finished, the soft scratch of the needle filling the silence between them. Without speaking, Michael moved to change it, selecting another vinyl from a carefully curated collection. The opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" filled the room. "Dance with me?" he asked, extending his hand. Winter hesitated only a moment before taking it. They'd danced at the wedding, of course, but that had been performed for the cameras, every move choreographed and practiced. This was different. Michael drew her close, one hand resting lightly on her waist, the other holding hers with unexpected gentleness. They moved together naturally, as if they'd been dancing like this for years instead of hours. "Where did you learn to really dance?" Winter asked softly. "Not the ballroom steps we practiced for the wedding. This kind of dancing." A shadow passed over Michael's face. "My mother taught me. After my father left, she was determined I would know all the social graces. We'd practice in the library of our old house using her record collection. She said a man who could dance properly would never be alone. Yet here you are, in an arranged marriage." "Here we are," he corrected softly. They danced in silence for a while, letting Fred Astaire's voice wash over them. Winter found herself relaxing into Michael's embrace, her head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder. She felt his surprise in the slight tension of his body, then felt him gradually relax as well. "Tell me something real," she murmured, as the song changed to Moonlight Serenade. "Something real. Something not in your PR file or my background check. Something true." Michael was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I hate sleeping in that massive bedroom. It's too quiet, too perfect. Sometimes I fall asleep in my office instead, with the sound of the city below." Winter lifted her head to look at him, surprised by the admission. "Why did you design it that way then?" "Because it's what someone like Michael Owen should have. The perfect penthouse, the perfect view, the perfect life." His smile was bitter. "Everything's always about perception." "Not everything," Winter said softly, reaching up to touch his cheek. The gesture surprised them both. "This room isn't about perception." Something changed in Michael's eyes then, something that made Winter's heart skip. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers. Unlike their wedding kiss, this one wasn't for show. It was soft, tentative, real. Winter found herself responding without thinking, her fingers sliding into his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way that would have horrified his PR team. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Michael rested his forehead against hers. "This wasn't in the contract," he murmured. "No," Winter agreed. "It wasn't." They stayed like that for a moment, suspended between reality and fantasy, between the roles they were supposed to play and the people they really were. The vintage clock on the mantel chimed softly, reminding them of the world outside. "I have meetings," Michael said reluctantly, straightening his tie. "The Asian merger won't wait, even for a honeymoon." Winter stepped back, smoothing her own clothes. "And I should visit Gethin, see how he's responding to the new treatment." They looked at each other in the warm light of the vintage room, both aware that something had shifted between them. Something unplanned and potentially dangerous. "Winter," Michael said as she reached the door. "Thank you for giving me one real moment in all of this." She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "Thank you for remembering that one casual comment about old movies, for creating this." She gestured to the room. "It's perfect." As she left to prepare for her hospital visit, Winter touched her lips softly, still feeling the ghost of their kiss. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. Feelings would only complicate their carefully structured arrangement. But as she caught her reflection in one of the penthouse's many mirrors, she saw something in her own eyes that scared her, a softness that hadn't been there before, a warmth that had nothing to do with contracts or obligations. In his office later that morning, Michael found himself unable to focus on the merger documents before him. His thoughts kept drifting back to the feel of Winter in his arms, the way she'd looked in the vintage room's soft light, the surprising rightness of her head resting against his shoulder. "Mr. Owen?" His assistant's voice broke through his reverie. "The board is waiting in the conference room." Michael straightened his tie, pushed away thoughts of dance music and candlelight. He had a role to play, an image to maintain. But for the first time in years, the mask felt uncomfortable, like it didn't quite fit anymore. As he walked to the conference room, he touched his own lips briefly, remembering their kiss. Something real had happened in that vintage room, something neither of them had anticipated or planned for, something that could either save them both or destroy everything they'd so carefully arranged. The day stretched ahead of them both, Michael in his meetings, Winter at the hospital with Gethin, but something had changed. Their contract marriage had taken an unexpected turn, and neither of them was quite sure where it would lead. But one thing was certain: their first night together, with its vintage charm and unplanned intimacy, had altered the trajectory of their arrangement in ways neither of them could have predicted. The question was, were they ready for what that meant? Chapter 5. Changes. The first month of their marriage brought changes neither Winter nor Michael had anticipated. The penthouse, once a showcase of minimalist luxury, began to show subtle signs of actually being lived in. Winter's well-worn paperbacks appeared on sleek shelves, their creased spines a stark contrast to Michael's pristine first editions. A hand-knitted throw, a gift from one of her former elderly neighbors, draped over the designer sofa. Small touches of warmth infiltrated the sterile perfection like wildflowers growing through cracks in concrete. Michael found himself lingering over breakfast, something he'd never done before. The morning sun would stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the gold undertones in Winter's skin as she read the newspaper, absently stirring honey into her tea. She'd taken to wearing simple cotton dresses around the penthouse, ignoring the closet full of designer clothes the PR team had selected. There was something about her natural grace that made even the simplest outfit look elegant. "You're staring again," Winter said one morning, not looking up from her paper. A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "You're wearing the blue dress," Michael replied, setting down his coffee. "The one you had before all this." Now she did look up, surprise flickering across her features. "You notice what I wear?" "I notice everything about you." The words hung between them, heavier than either had intended. Since their dance in the vintage room on their wedding night, something had shifted between them. Small moments of genuine connection kept breaking through their carefully maintained facade. "The board meeting is at 10, Winter said, changing the subject smoothly. She'd learned to read his schedule, to anticipate his days. "Will you be home for dinner?" Home. The word felt strange and right all at once. Michael adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture he'd never had before meeting her. "I should be, unless the Hong Kong delegates need more convincing about the merger." Winter nodded, returning to her paper, but as Michael stood to leave, she reached out and straightened his tie with practiced familiarity. Her fingers lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, and he caught a whiff of her subtle perfume, not the expensive French fragrance his PR team had selected, but something simpler, more her. "Winter," he said softly. "You've changed things." She looked up at him, her dark eyes questioning. "The penthouse. I know I should have asked before putting out the throw, but it gets cold in the evenings and—" "Not the penthouse," Michael interrupted gently. "Everything." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, the outside world intruding, as it always did. He left for the office, but her presence lingered with him like a perfume. Later that day, Winter sat beside Gethin's hospital bed, watching as he worked through his physical therapy exercises. The experimental treatment was working better than anyone had hoped. Her brother's strength was returning, his color improving daily. "You're different," Gethin observed, taking a break between sets. "Happier, maybe?" Winter busied herself adjusting his pillows. "The treatment's working. Of course I'm happy." "That's not what I mean." Gethin caught her hand, his grip stronger than it had been in months. It's him, isn't it, Michael? It's complicated. Love usually is. Winter pulled her hand away. This isn't love, Gethin. It's a contract, a business arrangement. Really? Her brother's smile was knowing. Is that why you light up every time your phone buzzes with a text from him? Why you absent-mindedly touch that tie pin he gave you? Why you... Enough, Winter cut him off, but gently. Focus on your exercises. But Gethin's words followed her throughout the day. She found herself in the vintage room Michael had created for their wedding night, which had somehow become her favorite place in the penthouse. She'd added her own touches here too. Old photographs in antique frames, classic books well loved enough to have broken spines, a quilt her mother had made that somehow worked perfectly with the 1950s decor. The door opened behind her, and she knew without turning that it was Michael. He'd taken to finding her here in quiet moments. Rough day, she asked, hearing the heaviness in his footsteps. The merger's complicated, cultural differences, time zones, egos. He loosened his tie, shedding his business persona like a heavy coat. But that's not what I want to talk about. Winter turned, taking in his appearance. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it. A habit she'd noticed emerged only when he was truly stressed. What do you want to talk about? Us. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and danger. Winter's heart picked up speed, but she kept her voice steady. What about us? Michael moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixing with the scent of coffee and long days at the office. This isn't what I expected, he said softly. The arrangement. You. His hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture achingly gentle. You've changed everything, Winter. The way I see my home, my life, myself. Michael, she whispered, half warning, half plea. I know this isn't part of the contract, he continued. I know we agreed to keep things professional, to maintain appearances without letting it become real. But... Instead of answering, he kissed her. Unlike their wedding kiss, unlike even their first real kiss in this room, this one held nothing back. Winter found herself responding with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his expensive shirt, wrinkling the pristine fabric. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Michael rested his forehead against hers. I'm breaking all my own rules, he murmured. Rules are meant to be broken, Winter replied, surprising herself with the boldness of the statement. He laughed softly, the sound rich and real. Who are you, and what have you done with the practical woman who told me she didn't believe in fairy tales? Maybe she's learning that some tales are worth believing in. They stayed like that for a moment, suspended between reality and possibility. Then Michael's phone buzzed, it always did, and the spell broke. Hong Kong, he sighed, checking the message. Go, Winter said softly. Be Michael Owen, business titan. I'll be here when you're done. He kissed her again, quickly but with feeling, before heading to his home office for the video call. Winter watched him go, her heart racing with emotions she hadn't planned for. Later that night, as they sat down to dinner, something they'd begun doing regularly, another change neither had anticipated. Winter noticed little things about Michael. The way he'd rolled up his sleeves, showing strong forearms marked with an old scar he'd never explained. How he'd learned to cook simple meals, preferring them to the elaborate catering he'd once relied on. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her, thinking she wouldn't notice. Tell me something real, she said, echoing their conversation from their wedding night. Michael set down his fork, considering. I've never been happier, he said simply. Because of the merger. Because of you. Winter felt her breath catch. This wasn't supposed to happen. They weren't supposed to fall in love, because that's what this was, wasn't it? love sneaking in through the cracks in their carefully constructed arrangement. "Michael," she began, but he shook his head. "I know what you're going to say, that this complicates things, that we had an agreement, that feelings will only make it harder when the contract ends." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "But what if I don't want it to end?" Before Winter could respond, the elevator chimed, someone coming up to the penthouse. They pulled apart quickly, resuming their practice poses as Carwin from the PR team burst in. "Tomorrow's charity gala," she announced, waving her tablet. "We need to go over the final details. Winter, darling, the Valentino dress has been delivered. Michael, remember to keep the focus on the children's hospital wing. It polls well with female demographics." Just like that, reality intruded. They were back to being Michael Owen and his contract wife, playing parts for the public's consumption. But as Winter met Michael's eyes across the table, she saw the truth there. Something real had grown between them, something neither had expected or planned for. The question was, what were they going to do about it? That night, lying in her bed in the blue suite, Winter touched her mother's locket and whispered into the darkness, "I think I'm falling in love with him, ma'am. Actually properly falling in love. What do I do?" But her mother's picture couldn't answer, and Winter was left with the growing realization that her heart had betrayed her careful plans. She'd signed up for a business arrangement and somehow found herself living a love story. In his own room, Michael stood at the windows, looking out over his city. But instead of seeing business opportunities and property values, he found himself imagining a future, a real one, with Winter. One where the contract was just paper, and what they felt for each other was the only truth that mattered. Change had come to the penthouse, to their lives, to their hearts. The question wasn't whether to accept it anymore, but how to embrace it without losing everything they'd built. And somewhere in the night, as the city glittered below them, two people who had started as strangers in a contract found themselves falling into something far more dangerous and beautiful than either had ever imagined possible. Chapter 6. Breaking Point. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glittered like a jewel box, its grand entrance awash in spotlights and camera flashes. The annual charity gala was the social event of the season, drawing the city's elite like moths to flame. Winter stood at the top of the marble steps, her heart heavy despite the lightness of her smile. The dress Michael had chosen was a masterpiece of diamonds and silk, worth more than most people earned in a year. The necklace that encircled her throat was even more valuable, a cascade of perfect diamonds that felt more like a collar with each passing moment. She touched her mother's locket, now hidden beneath the extravagant piece, drawing strength from its familiar shape. "Perfect," Michael whispered, his lips barely moving as they posed for photographs. "You look absolutely perfect." Once those words would have been just part of their act. But things had changed in the past months. Winter had seen behind Michael's carefully constructed facade, had fallen in love with the man who cooked her breakfast, and remembered how she liked her tea. The man who had created a vintage room just because she loved old movies. The man who was nothing like this public version of himself. "Mr. Owen," called a reporter. "The necklace. Is it new?" Michael's smile widened, practiced and perfect. "A special gift for my beautiful wife. 10 carats of the finest diamonds, each personally selected." His hand pressed against Winter's back, urging her to turn so the cameras could capture every angle. "Only the best for Mrs. Owen." Winter felt something inside her crack. The diamonds felt heavier with each word, each flash of cameras. This wasn't the Michael she'd come to know in private moments. This was Michael Owen, business titan, showing off his latest acquisition. Inside, the gala was a symphony of wealth and pretense. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors, while string quartets played in hidden alcoves. The city's most powerful people circulated like sharks, their designer clothes and jewelry a kind of armor. "Darling," Michael said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "let's show everyone your necklace. The craftsmanship really should be appreciated up close." Winter allowed herself to be led through the crowd, smiling and nodding as women exclaimed over the diamonds. She felt like a prized horse being paraded at auction, her worth measured in carats and designer labels. "It must be wonderful," said a woman in Chanel, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Being married to a man who can give you such things." "Like putting a collar on a pet," came a whispered comment from somewhere in the crowd. Winter felt the words like a physical blow. She turned to look at Michael, hoping to see a glimpse of the real man she'd fallen in love with, but he was deep in his public persona, bragging about the necklace's unique setting and astronomical cost. "Excuse me," Winter murmured, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I need some air." She made her way to a quiet balcony, her heels clicking against marble floors that had seen centuries of society drama. The night air was cool against her skin, helping to clear her head. Below, the city stretched out like a carpet of lights, reminding her of quiet evenings in the penthouse when Michael would point out buildings he'd helped develop. "Winter?" Michael's voice came from behind her. "The governor wants to meet you." "Of course he does," Winter said softly, not turning around. "Another powerful man to show off your expensive possession to—" "What?" She heard him step closer. "Winter, what's wrong?" Now she did turn, meeting his confused gaze. "Do you even see what you're doing? What you've been doing all night?" "I'm showing off my beautiful wife," Michael said, but there was uncertainty in his tone. The diamonds are a collar," Winter cut in, her voice breaking slightly. "A beautiful, expensive collar to show everyone that you own me. That's not, isn't it?" She reached up, fingers fumbling with the clasp of the necklace. "The Michael I've come to know, the real one who makes me tea and remembers how I take it, who created that beautiful vintage room because of one casual comment. He would understand why this hurts." "Winter, please." Michael reached for her, but she stepped back. "The press expects—" "The press, the board, the shareholders. When did their expectations become more important than what's real between us?" "This is business," Michael said, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "No," Winter replied softly. "This stopped being just business the moment you kissed me in that vintage room. The moment you started looking at me like I was more than a contract. The moment I fell in love with you." The last words hung in the air between them, the first time either had spoken them aloud. Michael's face showed a complex mix of emotions: love, fear, confusion. "Winter," he breathed, reaching for her again. But Winter had already unclasped the necklace. She placed it carefully in his hand, the diamonds catching the light one last time. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I can't pretend to be your perfect society wife, your latest acquisition to show off. I thought what was growing between us was strong enough to break through this facade, but tonight proved me wrong." "Please," Michael said, his public persona cracking. "We can talk about this at home." "Home," Winter repeated softly. "That penthouse stopped feeling like a home the moment you put this collar around my neck and paraded me around like a prize." She touched her mother's locket, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "Gethin's treatment is working. The latest tests show he's in remission. He'll live, thanks to you. That was our deal. His life for my cooperation in your public performance. But I can't keep sacrificing my soul for your image." "What are you saying?" Michael's voice held a note of fear she'd never heard before. Winter reached into her clutch, drawing out an envelope. "This is my goodbye. I've already packed my things, just what I brought with me, nothing you bought. The money for Gethin's treatment is all I'll take. You can tell the press whatever story works best for your image. No, Michael's voice cracked. Winter, please, I love... Don't, she interrupted gently. Don't say it now, when you've spent all evening proving that your public image means more than any real feelings between us. She pressed the envelope into his hand, alongside the diamond necklace. Then, in a gesture that broke both their hearts, she reached up and kissed his cheek, softly. Goodbye, Michael. Thank you for showing me that love could be real, even if it wasn't strong enough to survive your need to show off. Winter turned and walked away, her designer dress whispering against marble floors. She didn't look back, didn't see Michael standing frozen on the balcony, holding a fortune in diamonds in one hand and her goodbye letter in the other. Inside, the gala continued its glittering dance of wealth and power. No one noticed as Winter slipped through a side exit, leaving behind the world of luxury and pretense she'd never truly belonged in. A waiting taxi, arranged earlier when she'd made her decision, took her away from the museum, away from the life she'd thought might become real, away from the man she'd truly fallen in love with. In her hotel room later that night, Winter finally let her tears fall as she wrote in her journal, Dear Michael, the treatment worked. Gethin will live. I'm grateful beyond words for that gift. But I can't stay and watch the man I've fallen in love with disappear behind his public mask. Your world of endless showing off suffocates me. The man I love exists behind closed doors, but you won't let him live in the light. I'm setting you free from our contract. The money for Gethin's treatment is all I'll take. I won't be another possession for you to display, another piece of evidence of Michael Owen's wealth and power. I loved you, the real you, the one who cooked breakfast and remembered small details about my life, the one who created a perfect vintage room just because I mentioned loving old movies. But that man seems to get lost whenever there's an audience, replaced by someone who sees me as another acquisition to show off. Maybe someday you'll learn that real love isn't something to display like a diamond necklace. It's something to cherish quietly, completely, and truly. Goodbye, Winter. She sealed the letter, her tears making the ink blur slightly. Then she touched her mother's locket, the only piece of jewelry she'd kept, and whispered into the darkness, I did the right thing, didn't I, ma'am? Loving him wasn't enough if he couldn't love me more than his image. Across the city, in a penthouse that suddenly felt too large and too empty, Michael Owen stood in the vintage room he'd created for Winter. The diamond necklace lay forgotten on a side table, its brilliance dulled in the soft vintage lighting. He read her letter again and again, each word cutting deeper than the last. For the first time since his father left, Michael Owen cried. Not the careful, photogenic tears he'd learned to produce for sympathetic press coverage, but real, raw sobs that shook his whole body. He'd had something real, something precious, and he'd lost it because he couldn't stop playing the role he'd created for himself. The vintage room held echoes of their dance on their wedding night, of quiet evenings spent talking, of moments when the real Michael had emerged from behind his carefully constructed facade. Now it would stand as a monument to what he'd lost, the one person who had seen through his mask and loved what she found beneath it. Outside, the city continued its endless dance of light and shadow, unaware that a real love story had just ended because one man couldn't stop performing long enough to live it truly. Chapter 7. The Void. The first week after Winter left, Michael moved through his life like a ghost in his own world. The penthouse, once warmed by her presence, felt cavernous and cold. Her absence was everywhere, in the empty chair at breakfast, in the silence where her humming used to be, in the little touches she'd added to their home that he couldn't bring himself to remove. The vintage room remained locked. He'd fired an over-enthusiastic housekeeper who'd suggested clearing out Mrs. Owen's things. Everything stayed exactly as Winter had left it, from the old books on the shelves to the hand-knitted throw on the antique sofa. Even her scent lingered faintly, a subtle reminder of what he'd lost. "The press needs a statement," Carwin said, hovering anxiously in his office doorway. The PR team had been in crisis mode since the gala. "The speculation is getting out of control. Some are suggesting she was an accomplice in a corporate espionage scheme." Michael stared out his office window, the city spread before him like a kingdom he no longer wanted. "Tell them whatever you want," he said flatly. "Just leave her name clean." "But Mr. Owen, get out!" His voice held none of its usual polished authority. Instead, it carried the raw edge of a man barely holding himself together. Carwin retreated quickly, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts and the diamond necklace that still sat on his desk, a glittering reminder of his biggest mistake. The days blurred together. Michael cancelled meetings, ignored calls, retreated from the social circles he'd once dominated. His mother arrived unannounced one evening, letting herself into the penthouse with her emergency key. "Oh, Michael," Eleanor Owen said softly, finding her son sitting in the dark of the vintage room. He held Winter's goodbye letter in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other. "I warned you about hearts not following contracts." "She's gone, Mother." Michael's voice cracked. "I had something real, something precious, and I treated it like another business acquisition to show off." Eleanor moved through the room, turning on the vintage lamps that cast their warm glow over the carefully curated space. "Tell me what happened." So he did. He told her about the gala, about the diamond necklace that had felt like the perfect gesture to his public self, but had been a cruel mistake to his heart. He told her about Winter's words on the balcony, about the letter, about the way she'd kissed his cheek before walking away from their carefully constructed life. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, vulnerability raw in his voice. "Perhaps," Eleanor said gently, "that's because you're still thinking like Michael Owen, the business titan who can solve any problem with money or power. You need to think like Michael, the man who fell in love with a woman brave enough to walk away from all this luxury because she wanted something real." She picked up a framed photo from a side table, Winter and Michael at a charity event, both smiling perfectly for the cameras. "This isn't the smile I saw when she looked at you over breakfast," Eleanor observed. "You had something genuine growing here, son, but you couldn't stop performing long enough to let it bloom." "How do I find her?" Michael asked, setting down his glass. "I've had private investigators searching, but she's disappeared completely. The apartment she shared with Gethin is empty. Her old jobs have no forwarding address. Even the hospital won't tell me anything about Gethin's current treatment location." "Perhaps," Eleanor suggested, "that's because you're still trying to control everything. You're searching with money and power, the very things that drove her away." Michael stood, moving to the window. The city lights blurred through unshed tears. "I see her everywhere," he admitted softly. "In every crowd, every glimpse of dark skin and natural hair. I keep thinking I hear her laugh in restaurants, keep turning to share jokes only she would understand." "You're in love with her," Eleanor stated simply. "I am." The admission felt like surrender and salvation all at once. "Not the perfect society wife I tried to make her into, but the real Winter. The one who loved old movies and wore simple cotton dresses around the house. The one who called me out on my pretenses and made me want to be genuine." Eleanor watched her son carefully. She'd never seen him like this, not even after his father left. This was a different kind of pain, the agony of losing something authentic in a world built on facades. "The board is concerned," she said after a moment. "Your withdrawal from social circles, the cancelled meetings." "Let them be concerned." Michael turned from the window, and Eleanor was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the perfectly groomed business titan. In his place stood a man in rumpled clothes with several days' worth of stubble and eyes that had seen too little sleep. I can't go back to being that person." The one who measures everything in dollar signs and social impact. Then don't. Michael looked at his mother, surprised by the simple statement. Your father spent his whole life performing, Eleanor continued. It's why he left. He couldn't maintain the act anymore. You've spent years trying not to be him, but in some ways, you've been acting just as hard. Maybe it's time to be real. She crossed to him, straightening his collar in a gesture that reminded him painfully of how Winter used to adjust his ties. Find yourself first, she advised softly. The real Michael, not the one you created for the business world. Then maybe you can find her. After Eleanor left, Michael stood in the vintage room for a long time. Everything here was real. The antique furniture carefully sourced because Winter had mentioned loving old films, the record player that still held the vinyl they'd danced to on their wedding night, the photographs of her parents he'd had restored. He picked up Winter's letter again, reading words he'd already memorized. I loved you, the real you, the one who cooked breakfast and remembered small details about my life. The one who created a perfect vintage room just because I mentioned loving old movies. But that man seems to get lost whenever there's an audience, replaced by someone who sees me as another acquisition to show off. The words hurt just as much as they had the first time he'd read them. But now, something else stirred beneath the pain, determination. Michael spent the next week searching for Winter, but differently this time. He visited her old neighborhood, talking to people who had known her. He learned about the elderly neighbor whose hand-knitted throw still lay on his sofa, about the local bookstore where Winter had worked part-time during college, about the community center where she'd taught art to children. Each story revealed another facet of the woman he'd loved without fully understanding. Winter hadn't just been his perfect society wife. She'd been a vital part of a community, a woman who touched lives in quiet but meaningful ways. The press continued to speculate about their separation. Michael's PR team crafted careful statements about mutual agreement and respect for privacy. But the tabloids ran wild with theories. Some painted Winter as a gold digger who'd fled with millions. Others suggested corporate espionage or scandal. Michael read each story with growing disgust at the world he'd been part of for so long. The same publications that had once praised their fairy tale romance now competed to tear it apart for headlines. One morning he walked into his office building and straight to Carwin's desk. Cancel everything, he ordered. But sir, the Asian merger, cancel it all. He pulled off his perfectly knotted tie, a gesture that felt symbolic somehow. I'm taking a leave of absence. The next few hours were chaos. The board called an emergency meeting. Shareholders panicked. Stock prices fluctuated. But for the first time in his adult life, Michael didn't care about any of it. He went home to the penthouse, to the vintage room that held more truth than the rest of his life combined. Sitting in the soft lamplight, surrounded by memories of Winter, he began to write. Dear Winter, you were right about everything. I've spent so long performing that I forgot how to be real. The man you fell in love with, the one who cooked breakfast and created this room, that's who I want to be. Not just behind closed doors, but in every moment of my life. I'm learning about the Winter I never fully knew, the one who touched lives in her community, who worked 3 jobs to support her brother, who never needed diamonds to shine. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if I'll find you to give you these words. But I'm done performing. I'm done measuring life in stock prices and social standing. I love you, the real you, all of you. And I'm finally ready to be the real me, whether or not you're here to see it. I'm sorry I made you feel like a possession. You were always the most valuable thing in my life, and I was too blind to see that value had nothing to do with price tags or public perception. With love, the real Michael. He sealed the letter, but didn't send it. Instead, he placed it in the vintage room, next to the record player that still held their wedding night song. Then he went to his closet and began packing a simple bag. The real Michael Owen had a lot of work to do, starting with finding himself beneath years of careful performance. Only then could he hope to find Winter again, not to possess her or display her, but to love her truly, completely, and without pretense. The void she'd left in his life wasn't just an absence. It was a space for growth, for transformation, for becoming the man who deserved the kind of love she'd offered, real, unvarnished, and more precious than all the diamonds in the world. Chapter 8. Reflection. 3 months after Winter's departure, Michael Owen stood in front of his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing himself. His perfectly trimmed hair had grown longer, stubble shadowed his jaw, and his designer suits hung untouched in their closet. Instead, he wore simple jeans and a cotton shirt. The kind of clothes the old Michael would never have been caught dead in. The transformation wasn't just external. Each day without Winter had forced him to confront the artifice of his former life. He'd spent weeks driving through the city, visiting the places that had meant something to her. The small bookstore where she'd worked during college became his regular haunt. The elderly owner, Mrs. Griffiths, had initially watched him with suspicion, but gradually warmed to his presence. "She used to sit right there," Mrs. Griffiths told him one rainy afternoon, pointing to a worn armchair in the corner. "Reading to the neighborhood children every Saturday morning. Those kids adored her." Michael ran his fingers over the chair's frayed fabric, imagining Winter there, surrounded by children, her voice bringing stories to life. This was the woman he'd tried to transform into a society trophy, and the realization made him ache with regret. He'd visited the community center next, where Winter had taught art classes. The walls still displayed some of her students' work, bright splashes of color and hope in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The center's director, an older man named Harry, had regarded Michael with a mixture of recognition and wariness. "Why are you here, Mr. Owen?" Harry had asked directly. "Our Winter isn't some lost possession for you to reclaim." The words had stung, but Michael appreciated their honesty. "I'm not here to reclaim anything," he'd replied. "I'm here to understand what I failed to see before." Now, months later, that understanding was slowly taking shape. Michael had discovered a Winter he'd never truly known, a woman who had woven herself into the fabric of her community, who had touched lives in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or status. He spent his mornings in the vintage room, surrounded by the careful details he'd once commissioned to impress her. But now, he saw them differently. Each piece told a story of the man he could have been, someone who paid attention, who cared about more than appearances, who understood that love wasn't measured in carats. The diamond necklace that had been the final straw lay in its velvet box, untouched. Michael couldn't bear to look at it, remembering how it had felt like a collar around Winter's neck. He'd considered selling it and donating the money to the community center, but something held him back. Perhaps the need to keep this reminder of his greatest mistake. One particularly sleepless night, he found himself driving to their old spots. The park where they'd walked at sunset. The small cafe where Winter had first made him try bubble tea, a memory that now made him smile, remembering his confused expression at the tapioca pearls. Each place held echoes of the real relationship that had grown beneath their contractual arrangement. He pulled up to the hospital where Gethin had received his treatment. The night staff recognized him. He'd been coming here often, not searching for Winter, but trying to understand the depth of her sacrifice. A young nurse named Alwyn, different from his former receptionist, had finally taken pity on him. "She used to sit there for hours," Alwyn told him, pointing to a chair in the oncology ward's waiting room. Even after working 3 shifts at different jobs, she'd come and read to her brother, never letting him see how exhausted she was. Michael sat in that chair now, feeling its uncomfortable plastic dig into his back. Winter had spent countless hours here, worried about Gethin, while Michael had been in his luxury office, concerned about stock prices and public image. "Your mother was right," he said aloud to the empty waiting room. "I spent so long trying not to be my father that I became something just as false." The revelation had led to more changes. Michael had shocked his board of directors by announcing a complete restructuring of the Owen Foundation's charitable giving. Instead of the usual high-profile galas and publicity-friendly donations, he directed resources to community programs like the ones Winter had supported. His PR team had nearly had collective heart failure when he'd shown up at the community center in jeans and work boots, helping to repair the aging building. Photos had leaked to the press, of course. Michael Owen, billionaire, doing manual labor alongside local volunteers. But for once, he hadn't cared about the image. He'd cared about honoring Winter's legacy of quiet, meaningful work. The business world buzzed with speculation about his transformation. Some suggested a mental breakdown, others a calculated rebranding strategy. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Michael Owen was finally becoming real. He'd sold the penthouse. Too many memories echoed through its perfect rooms. The vintage room had been carefully dismantled, each piece stored in a warehouse along with Winter's letter and the diamond necklace. Instead, he'd moved into a modest brownstone in her old neighborhood, much to the horror of his social circle. His mother visited him there one evening, looking surprisingly at home in the cozy living room. "You've changed," she observed, sipping tea from a mismatched cup. "I had to," Michael replied, watching the sunset paint the worn hardwood floors golden. "The man I was, he lost something precious because he couldn't stop performing." Eleanor studied her son carefully. "And this new version of yourself? Is he ready to find her?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if I have the right to find her," he admitted. "She left because I treated our love like a business asset. Finding her now, wouldn't that be just another form of trying to possess her?" "Perhaps," Eleanor suggested gently. "It depends on your intentions. Are you searching for her to reclaim what you lost, or to show her who you've become?" The question haunted Michael long after his mother left. He spent the night walking through the city, letting his feet carry him to places that held memories of Winter. The small park where she'd once stopped to help a lost child find his mother. The street corner where she'd given her umbrella to an elderly man caught in a sudden downpour. The bakery where she'd bought treats for the neighborhood kids, never letting on that she was stretching her own tight budget to do so. Each story he'd discovered about her revealed the depth of what he'd failed to see when she was his wife. He'd been so focused on molding her into his perfect society spouse that he'd missed the perfect person she already was. Dawn found him at the bookstore again, helping Mrs. Griffiths set up for the day. As he arranged children's books in the reading corner, he found himself smiling at the worn spines and dog-eared pages. These books had been loved, really loved, not kept pristine for show like his first editions at home. "You're not what I expected," Mrs. Griffith said suddenly, watching him work. "When Winter married you, well, we all thought she was making a deal with the devil, selling herself to save her brother." Michael's hands stilled on a copy of The Little Prince. "She was," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it was. But somewhere along the way, it became real. At least, it did for me. And now?" He looked around the small bookstore, with its mismatched chairs and slightly crooked shelves. "Now I understand what she tried to show me all along. That real value isn't in price tags or public perception. It's in the lives we touch, the love we share, the truth we live." Mrs. Griffiths nodded slowly. "You loved her." "Love," Michael corrected softly. "Present tense. I love her still." The old woman's expression softened. "Then perhaps you're finally becoming someone worthy of her love in return." That night, back in his brownstone, Michael sat down to write another letter he knew he might never send. Dearest Winter, today I sat in your old chair at the bookstore, imagining you reading to children who soar past wealth and status to love you for your heart. I helped fix a leaky roof at the community center, where your art students still talk about their amazing teacher. I walked the streets where you left quiet kindnesses like breadcrumbs, touching lives in ways I was too blind to see. I'm learning, slowly, what real value means. The diamond necklace that drove you away sits in storage, a reminder of how badly I misunderstood what makes something precious. Your old cotton dresses, the ones I once thought weren't good enough for Michael Owen's wife, now seem like symbols of an authenticity I'm only beginning to grasp. I don't know if I'll ever find you again. Perhaps I don't deserve to. But I want you to know that the man you glimpsed behind my careful facade, the one who cooked breakfast and created the vintage room, he's finally finding the courage to exist in daylight. You taught me that real love isn't something to display. It's something to live, quietly and truly, in all the small moments that make up a life. I'm sorry I learned this lesson too late. With endless love, Michael. He folded the letter carefully and added it to a growing collection. Words he wrote to Winter but never sent, tracking his journey from the man who had lost her to the person he was becoming. The next morning, he returned to the community center. There was a wall to paint, and somewhere in the work of making something beautiful in a humble place, he felt closer to understanding the woman who had walked away from his world of glitter and show to return to what was real. As he painted, a small girl watched him curiously. "Are you really a billionaire?" she asked finally. Michael smiled, gesturing to his paint-splattered jeans. "I'm just someone trying to make things a little better," he replied, "like Winter used to do." The child's face lit up. "You knew Miss Winter?" "She taught me to draw butterflies." And there, in a child's simple joy at creating art, Michael finally understood completely what he had lost, and what he needed to become if he ever hoped to find it again. The transformation of Michael Owen continued, not as a performance for public consumption, but as a genuine metamorphosis of the heart. Each day brought new lessons in authenticity, new opportunities to strip away the layers of pretense he'd built over years. The business world might not understand, but for the first time in his adult life, Michael didn't care about their understanding. He cared about being real, about living truth instead of performing it. And somewhere out there, he hoped, Winter might see this change and know that her leaving had created space for something genuine to grow from the ashes of their carefully scripted romance. Chapter 9. Discovery. Spring had turned to summer, and summer was fading into autumn when Michael finally heard the words he'd been both longing for and dreading. "I know where she is." Mrs. Griffiths stood in her bookstore's doorway, watching him arrange new children's books on the shelves, a task he'd taken to doing every Tuesday morning. In the 6 months since Winter's departure, he'd become as much a fixture here as the worn armchair in the reading corner. "How?" Michael asked softly, his hands stilling on a copy of The Secret Garden. The elderly bookstore owner moved carefully to her usual chair, settling into its familiar embrace. "My niece works at a children's hospital in Cedar Grove, about 3 hours up the coast. She called me last night, all excited about their new art therapy program." She paused, watching Michael's face. "Seems they have this wonderful teacher who wears a silver locket and tells the most amazing stories about her brother's recovery." Michael's heart thundered in his chest. He'd imagined finding Winter so many times, played out countless scenarios of their reunion. But now that the moment was real, he felt almost afraid. "She's happy there," Mrs. Griffiths continued gently, "teaching art to sick children, helping them find joy in creating beauty during their hardest moments. It's very winter. Yes, it was. Of course, she'd found a way to turn her own experience with Gethin's illness into something that helped others. That was who she'd always been, who she'd tried to show him she was, beneath all the designer clothes and society events he'd pushed on her. "When did she start working there?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "About 3 months ago, after she finished setting up that community art program in Bristol." Mrs. Griffiths smiled at his surprise. "Oh yes, she's been busy. My niece says the children adore her. She spends extra time with the ones whose families can't visit often, reads to them, teaches them to draw their dreams." Michael sat heavily in Winter's old reading chair, emotions washing over him in waves. She was okay. She was doing meaningful work. She was still wearing the locket with her parents' pictures, the one true piece of jewelry she'd ever cared about. "I shouldn't go to her," he said finally. "She left for a reason. She's built a new life." Mrs. Griffiths made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "You've changed, Michael Owen. The man who first walked into my shop looking for traces of his runaway wife would have jumped into his expensive car and rushed to reclaim her. But this man—" She gestured to his paint-stained jeans and casual shirt. "This man understands that love isn't about possession. I understand a lot of things now that I wish I'd understood then." The next few days passed in a blur of internal debate. Michael threw himself into community center work, trying to distract himself from the knowledge burning in his mind. Cedar Grove. She was in Cedar Grove, teaching art to sick children, probably wearing one of her simple cotton dresses, her natural hair arranged in those elegant twists he'd once foolishly thought needed updating for society events. One evening, he found himself in the warehouse where he'd stored the contents of the vintage room. Everything was carefully preserved: the record player, the antique furniture, the photographs he'd had restored. The diamond necklace that had been the final straw sat in its velvet box, untouched since that night. Michael opened the box, letting the stones catch the dim light. Once, he'd thought this was the perfect gift, expensive, showy, a way to display his wealth and her beauty to the world. Now he saw it differently. The necklace wasn't a gift of love, it was a symbol of everything he'd gotten wrong. Making a sudden decision, he drove to the community center the next morning. Harry was there, overseeing repairs to the aging heating system. "I need your help," Michael said, holding out the velvet box. "I want to sell this and use the money to establish an art therapy program here, like the one Winter used to run." Harry opened the box, whistling softly at the diamonds. "That's a lot of funding." "It's what I should have done in the first place," Michael replied. "Instead of trying to turn Winter into someone she wasn't, I should have supported who she actually was. The sale of the necklace provided enough funding to not only establish the art program, but also renovate the center's entire third floor into proper studio spaces." Michael worked alongside the construction crew, learning to use tools he'd never touched before, getting blisters on hands that had once been perfectly manicured. A week after the sale, he received another piece of news that set his heart racing. The children's hospital where Winter worked was looking for donors to expand their art therapy program. The universe, it seemed, was offering him a chance. "But how do I do this right?" he asked his mother over dinner in his modest brownstone. "I can't just show up with a big check and expect her to fall into my arms." Eleanor Owen, who had surprised everyone by adapting beautifully to her son's simpler lifestyle, considered the question carefully. What would the old Michael Owen have done? Made a grand gesture, thrown money at it, turned it into a media event to show what a generous person I'd become. He ran a hand through his now longer hair. Everything that would make Winter run again. And what does this Michael want to do? He was quiet for a long moment, pushing food around his plate. I want to help because it's the right thing to do, because those children deserve beautiful spaces to create in, and Winter deserves the resources to teach them properly. But I don't want her to feel obligated or pressured. I don't want it to be about me at all. Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Then I think you have your answer. The next day, Michael had his lawyers set up an anonymous donation to the Children's Hospital's art therapy program. The money would provide everything they needed: supplies, equipment, dedicated space, but his name appeared nowhere in the paperwork. He also began making quiet inquiries about nearby properties. If there was any chance of reconnecting with Winter, he wanted to be close enough to prove his commitment to change wasn't temporary. He found a small house with good bones that needed work, real work, not just cosmetic updates. "You're going to renovate it yourself?" his mother asked, surveying the peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. "With help," Michael admitted, "but yes, I want to create something real with my own hands, like Winter does with her art." As autumn painted the coast in brilliant colors, Michael divided his time between the community center in the city and his renovation project in Cedar Grove. He learned from local craftsmen, making mistakes and learning from them, gradually transforming the old house into something warm and welcoming. He didn't go to the hospital. Not yet. Instead, he collected quiet news about Winter from Mrs. Griffiths' niece. She was thriving in her work. The children were responding beautifully to her program. She seemed happy, though sometimes a certain song on the radio would make her eyes go distant and she'd touch her locket with a look of remembered pain. One crisp October morning, Michael stood in what would become the house's library, carefully restoring the original hardwood floors. Through the window, he could see the hospital in the distance, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the historic homes around it. "I'm doing this right this time," he whispered to the empty room. "No grand gestures, no public performances, just real work, real change, real love." He'd written another letter the night before, adding to his collection of unsent words. "Dearest Winter, I'm closer to you now than I've been in months, yet I'm forcing myself to stay away." The old Michael would have burst into your art therapy session with cameras and grand declarations. He would have tried to win you back with money and showmanship, missing the point entirely again. But I'm learning that love isn't about possession or display. It's about support without demands, care without conditions, truth without performance. I've seen some of your students' artwork displayed in the hospital lobby. Their joy shines through every brushstroke, every crayon line. You're doing what you were always meant to do, helping others find their light in dark moments. Just like you helped me find mine, though I realized it too late. The house I'm renovating has a perfect space for an art studio. Large windows, northern light, wooden floors that have seen a century of life. Sometimes I imagine you painting here, teaching here, filling this space with the creativity you bring to everything you touch. But that's getting ahead of myself. First, I have to prove, to you and to myself, that this change is real and permanent, that I've learned to value what truly matters. I love you, not as something to display or possess, but as someone to cherish and support. When I'm ready to tell you this in person, I hope you'll find that the man standing before you is finally worthy of your kind of love. Until then, I'll keep working, keep learning, keep becoming real. All my love, Michael. He folded the letter carefully and added it to the growing collection in his workshop. Then he returned to his work on the floor, each careful movement bringing him closer to the man he needed to be. In the distance, a group of children's laughter drifted from the hospital's outdoor playground. Michael paused in his work, wondering if Winter was out there with them, teaching them to find beauty in simple moments. Soon, he promised himself. Soon he would find a way to show her that her leaving hadn't broken him. It had rebuilt him into someone real. Someone who understood that love wasn't measured in carats or captured in society photographs. Someone who was finally ready to love her the way she deserved to be loved, truly, deeply, and without pretense. Chapter 10. Reunion. The children's art therapy room at Cedar Grove Hospital was alive with color and laughter. Winter moved among her students, her simple cotton dress splattered with paint, her natural hair tied back with a colorful scarf. She paused beside a young girl working on a butterfly painting, offering gentle encouragement. "The colors are perfect, Lily," she said softly, watching the child blend purples and blues. "Just like the butterfly we saw in the garden yesterday." 6 months had passed since she'd left her life as Mrs. Michael Owen. The diamond necklace that had felt like a collar, the designer dresses that had never quite fit right, the endless social performances, all of it seemed like a distant dream now. Here, surrounded by children finding joy through art despite their illnesses, she'd found her true purpose. The sudden expansion of her program had been unexpected but welcome. An anonymous donor had provided everything they needed: art supplies, equipment, even funds to renovate a dedicated space. Winter had her suspicions about the source, especially after hearing about Michael's transformation through occasional news that reached her. But the donation had come with no strings, no public announcements, no attempts to contact her. If it was him, he'd finally learned the value of quiet generosity. "Miss Winter," called Tommy, a 7-year-old undergoing chemotherapy, "can you help me with my house?" She moved to his easel, smiling at his artwork. He was painting a small house with a garden, similar to the ones in the historic neighborhood near the hospital. "It's beautiful, Tommy. Tell me about it." "It's the house down the street, the one being fixed up. I see the man working on it from my window. He waves to us sometimes when we're in the playground." Winter's heart stuttered. She'd seen the house too, had watched its gradual transformation over the past weeks. Sometimes, in early mornings or late evenings, she caught glimpses of a tall figure working there. She'd never let herself look too closely, afraid of what or who she might recognize. The afternoon session ended with their usual ritual, displaying new artwork on the gallery wall and celebrating each child's creativity. Winter loved this part, seeing their proud faces as they shared their work. It reminded her of the community center where she'd taught before everything changed. As the children returned to their rooms, Winter began cleaning up. The setting sun painted the art room in warm golds and soft shadows, reminding her painfully of mornings in the penthouse, watching the sunrise with Michael. She touched her locket, a habit she'd never broken. "You've created something beautiful here." The voice froze her in place, deep, familiar, but somehow different, softer, less polished than she remembered. Winter turned slowly. Michael stood in the doorway, but not the Michael she'd left. His expensive suit was replaced by worn jeans and a simple button-down shirt. His once perfect hair was longer, slightly tousled, and stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that showed the most change. The careful mask of confidence was gone, replaced by something raw and real. "The children's artwork," he continued when she didn't speak. "It's incredible. They put their whole hearts into it." Winter set down the brushes she'd been cleaning. "Why are you here, Michael?" "Not to reclaim you," he said quietly. "Not to make grand gestures or try to buy back what we had. I'm here because—" He paused, running a hand through his hair. A nervous gesture the old Michael would never have allowed. "Because I finally understand what you tried to show me all along." "And what's that?" "That real value isn't in price tags or public perception. It's in moments like this. Children finding joy through art, people helping each other without expecting anything in return. Love that doesn't need to be displayed to be real." Winter studied him, noting the paint under his fingernails, the slight tan suggesting time spent working outdoors, the way he stood, less rigid, more natural. You've changed. I had to. He took a step into the room, but kept his distance, respecting her space. Losing you. It made me see how false my life had become. How I'd spent so long performing that I'd forgotten how to be genuine. The anonymous donation, Winter said. It wasn't a question. Michael nodded. These children deserve a beautiful space to create in. You deserve the resources to teach them properly. But it wasn't about getting credit or making a show of generosity. And the house Tommy was painting. My home now, or it will be once the renovation is finished. I'm doing most of the work myself, learning as I go, making plenty of mistakes. He smiled slightly. The old Michael Owen would have hired the best contractors and had it done in a week. This Michael wants to create something real with his own hands. Winter turned to the window, looking out at the garden where she often took the children to draw. Why here, Michael? Why Cedar Grove? Because you're here, he admitted softly. Not to pressure you or try to win you back. Just to be close enough to prove that this change is real, that I've learned what matters. She felt him move closer, though he still kept a respectful distance. I sold the diamond necklace, he continued, used the money to start an art therapy program at the community center where you used to teach. The vintage room is in storage. I couldn't bring myself to dismantle it completely. Too many real moments happened there. Winter touched her locket again, remembering their dance on their wedding night, the first time she'd seen the real Michael emerge from behind his careful facade. I miss you, Michael said quietly. Not the society wife I tried to make you into, but you, the woman who loves old movies and reads to sick children, who calls out pretense and values truth above appearance. I miss your laugh in the morning, the way you'd straighten my tie without thinking, how you made that massive penthouse feel like a real home. Michael, Winter began, but he held up a hand. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I needed you to know that your leaving didn't break me. It rebuilt me into someone who finally understands what you tried to teach me all along. He turned to go, pausing at the door. The house has a perfect space for an art studio, he said softly. Large windows, northern light. I find myself imagining you teaching there, creating there. But that's getting ahead of myself. First, I have to prove, to you and to myself, that this change is permanent, that I've learned to value what truly matters. Winter watched him walk away, her heart thundering in her chest. Through the window, she could see the house he'd mentioned, its gradual transformation mirroring his own. She'd watched from a distance as windows were replaced, walls were repaired, gardens were planted, all done slowly, carefully, with attention to detail rather than speed of completion. Later that night, in her small apartment overlooking the hospital gardens, Winter pulled out her journal. She'd been writing to Michael too, letters she'd never sent. Dear Michael, I saw you today, finally, after all these months. Not the Michael Owen I left, but someone new. Or perhaps someone who was always there, hidden beneath the performance. Your hands have calluses now. Your clothes are worn from real work. Your smile isn't practiced anymore. It reaches your eyes in a way it never did at those society events. The anonymous donation. That's what told me you'd really changed. The old Michael would have made it a media event, would have expected praise and recognition, but you did it quietly, simply because it was needed. I watch you sometimes, working on that house. You wave to the children in the playground, take time to show them your tools, explain what you're doing. You're building something real, both in that house and in yourself. Part of me wants to run again, to protect my heart from hoping. But another part remembers the man who created a vintage room because I mentioned loving old movies once. The man who cooked breakfast and remembered how I take my tea. Maybe that man and this new version of you, maybe they're finally the same person. I don't know what happens next, but for the first time since I left, I'm curious to find out. Love, Winter. She sealed the letter with others she'd written over the months, each one tracking her own journey of healing and growth. Outside her window, the lights of Cedar Grove twinkled like earthbound stars. In the distance, she could see a single light burning in Michael's house. His workshop, she knew from watching. He often worked late into the night, creating something real with his own hands. Tomorrow she'd see him again at the hospital. He'd been coming regularly now, not to see her, but to help with the children's art sessions. The kids adored him, especially when he told them stories about the house he was fixing up. He never pushed for more, never tried to reclaim what they'd lost. Instead, he simply existed in her orbit, proving through actions rather than words that his change was genuine. Winter touched her locket, opening it to look at her parents' smiling faces. "What do you think?" she whispered. "Has he really changed? Has he finally learned that love isn't something to display, but something to live?" The photos couldn't answer, of course, but as she got ready for bed, Winter found herself humming the song they'd danced to in the vintage room. For the first time since leaving, the memory didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like a promise of something new, something real, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 11. The Party. The Cedar Grove. Children's Hospital had never seen an event quite like this. The newly renovated art therapy wing was transformed, but not with the expensive decorations and elaborate displays that had characterized Michael Owen's previous parties. Instead, the space was filled with children's artwork, hung with care and lit to showcase each piece's unique beauty. String lights twinkled softly overhead, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. Local musicians played gentle acoustic music in the corner, their sound mixing with the happy chatter of guests. The catering came from small local restaurants, comfort food served on mismatched vintage plates that reminded Winter of their wedding night in the vintage room. Michael stood at the podium, looking both familiar and strange to Winter. He wore a simple dark suit, no tie, his longer hair slightly tousled. Gone was the perfectly polished business titan. In his place stood a man who had learned the value of authenticity. "Welcome," he began, his voice carrying none of its old practiced smoothness. "This isn't the kind of party I used to throw. There are no diamond displays, no champagne fountains, no press releases about charitable giving." He smiled, and Winter's heart caught at how genuine it looked. "Instead, we're here to celebrate something real, the creativity and courage of these amazing children, and the power of art to heal." Winter watched from the back of the room, where she stood with her students. Tommy clutched her hand excitedly, proud to see his butterfly painting prominently displayed. The other children fidgeted in their party clothes, eager to show their families their artwork. "6 months ago," Michael continued, "I knew nothing about art therapy. I knew nothing about real value or genuine connection. I measured everything in dollars and social impact." His eyes found Winter's across the room. "Someone very wise showed me how empty that way of living was." The crowd was a mix of hospital staff, patients and their families, local community members, and yes, some of the society figures from Michael's old world. The contrast was striking: designer dresses next to simple Sunday best, expensive watches alongside plastic hospital bands. "The Owen Foundation is changing," Michael announced. "No more galas for the sake of publicity, no more performative charity. Instead, we're focusing on real needs, real communities, real people." He gestured to the artwork around them. "Every piece here tells a story of courage, of hope, of finding beauty in difficult moments. These children have taught me more about genuine worth than all my years in business ever did." Winter felt tears prick her eyes as Michael spoke about each child's work, remembering specific details about their progress and struggles. He'd been there, she realized, really there, not just as a donor or figurehead, but as someone who had taken the time to know these children, to understand their stories. "And none of this would be possible," Michael said softly, "without our incredible art therapy team, led by someone who once taught me that real love isn't something to display. It's something to live, quietly and truly, in all the small moments that make up a life." Their eyes met again, and Winter saw in Michael's gaze all the words he wasn't saying. This party wasn't a grand gesture to win her back. It was a public declaration of transformation, a way of showing the world, and her, that his change was permanent and real. After the speeches, as families mingled and children proudly showed off their work, Winter found herself drawn to the quiet garden terrace. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from nearby homes. "You did all this for them," she said as Michael joined her, keeping a respectful distance. "Not for show, not for publicity." "I did it because it matters," he replied simply. "Because art saved these kids' spirits while medicine saved their bodies. Because you showed me that real value isn't in price tags or social standing." Winter touched her locket, a gesture Michael remembered well. "The Michael Owen I married would have made this a media circus. The Michael Owen you married was a carefully constructed facade." He moved to the terrace railing, looking out over the hospital gardens. "I'm not that man anymore. I'm not sure I ever really was." "Then who are you?" Michael turned to her, and in the soft garden lights, Winter saw every change these months had wrought, not just in his appearance, but in his soul. "I'm someone who finally understands what you tried to show me all along. That real love, real value, real life, they're found in quiet moments and genuine connections, not in public displays and society photographs." Inside, Tommy's laughter rang out as he showed his grandmother his artwork. The sound carried to the terrace, reminding them both of what really mattered. "The house is almost finished," Michael said softly. "I left the art studio for last, wanted to make sure everything was perfect, the light, the space, the feeling." "Michael, I'm not asking for anything," he assured her quickly. I want you to know that everything I've done, the house, the foundation changes, this party, it wasn't about winning you back. It was about becoming someone real, someone worthy of the kind of love you showed me was possible." Winter studied him in the gathering dusk. "And if I never come back?" "Then I'll still be grateful," he said simply, "because losing you taught me how to be genuine, how to value what truly matters, how to love without trying to possess or display." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the party inside. Finally, Winter spoke. "I wrote you letters too," she admitted. "Never sent them, but I wrote about watching you work on the house, about seeing you with the children, about noticing all the ways you've changed." "I have a collection of unsent letters myself," Michael smiled. "They track my journey from the man you left to whoever I am now." "And who is that?" Michael considered the question carefully. "Someone who's learned that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or shown off. Someone who wants to build something real, with his hands, with his heart, with his life." Inside, the music changed to a familiar tune. "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song they danced to in the vintage room on their wedding night. Winter felt tears prick her eyes at the memory. "I kept it all," Michael said softly. "The vintage room, packed carefully in storage, not because I expect to recreate that moment, but because it was the first real thing between us. The first time I did something purely to make you happy, not to show off or impress." Winter touched his arm gently. their first physical contact since his return. "Dance with me?" Michael's eyes widened in surprise, but he took her hand carefully, as if she might disappear at any moment. They moved together on the terrace, their steps falling into familiar patterns. But this wasn't like their practiced wedding dance, or even their first real dance in the vintage room. This was something new, something genuine and unplanned. "I'm still afraid," Winter whispered against his shoulder. "Of what? Of hoping, of believing this change is real, of falling in love with you again." Michael's arms tightened slightly around her. "I'm afraid too," he admitted. "Afraid I'll fall back into old habits. Afraid I'll never be worthy of your kind of love. Afraid this moment will end and you'll walk away again." Winter lifted her head to look at him. The old Michael Owen would never have admitted to being afraid of anything. The old Michael Owen was a fool who lost the most precious thing in his life because he couldn't stop performing. The song ended, but they stayed in their embrace, both aware that something had shifted between them. Inside, the party continued, children laughing, families celebrating, a community coming together in genuine joy. "I'm not ready," Winter said finally, stepping back slightly. "Not yet." Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know. I'm still becoming the person I need to be, still learning, still growing, still making mistakes and learning from them. But maybe," Winter smiled softly, "maybe I'd like to see that art studio sometime, when it's finished." "It will be ready when you are," Michael replied simply. And in those words was a promise, not of grand gestures or public displays, but of patient love and genuine change. They rejoined the party separately, but something had changed. A door had opened, just slightly, letting in the possibility of a new kind of love, one built on truth rather than performance, on genuine connection rather than public display. And in the golden light of the children's art wing, surrounded by real joy and authentic celebration, both Winter and Michael felt something they hadn't dared feel in months. Hope. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. The morning sun painted Cedar Grove's historic streets in shades of gold when Winter stood before Michael's restored house for the first time. Her fingers traced the wrought iron gate, feeling the careful work he'd put into its restoration, not replaced with something expensive and new, but lovingly brought back to life. Like so many things between them now, the garden bloomed with purpose. Wild roses climbing trellises he'd built himself, herbs and vegetables growing in raised beds that showed daily attention. A stone path, laid piece by his own hands, led to the front door. Everything spoke of patience, of careful work, of real love invested in creating something genuine. "Ready?" Michael's voice came softly from behind her. He looked different now, peaceful in a way she'd never seen during their first marriage. Dressed in simple work clothes, his hands showing the honest wear of manual labor, he seemed more handsome than he ever had in his expensive suits. Inside, the house took Winter's breath away. Michael had preserved its historic character while making it warmly livable. Original hardwood floors glowed with careful restoration. Walls painted in soft colors captured the natural light. And everywhere she looked showed evidence of genuine work and thoughtful detail. "The furniture," she gasped softly, recognizing pieces from their vintage room. "Some pieces I built myself," Michael explained, watching her reaction carefully. "But yes, I brought the special things, the record player, the photographs, the memories worth keeping." They moved through the house slowly, Michael showing her how he'd restored each room with his own hands. The kitchen especially showed his growth, warm and welcoming, with a well-used cooking space rather than the showpiece kitchens he'd once preferred. "And this," he said finally, leading her upstairs, "is what I've been working on most recently." The art studio was perfect. Huge windows facing north for ideal light, original wooden floors sanded smooth, built-in storage for supplies, and a reading nook filled with children's books. Through the windows, she could see the hospital where she taught, close enough for her students to visit for special lessons. A smaller room connected to the studio held her old teaching desk from the community center, restored to gleaming beauty. Photographs of her parents hung on the walls, along with framed artwork from her students over the years. And there, in a place of honor, stood their wedding photo, not the formal society shot, but a candid moment of them dancing in the vintage room, both laughing at some forgotten joke. "I'm not asking you to move in," Michael said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything except a chance to show you who I've become. This space. It's yours, whether we're together or not. The children need it, and you deserve a place to create and teach that's truly yours." Winter turned to him, really looking at the man he'd become. Gone was the carefully constructed facade of Michael Owen, business titan. Instead, she saw someone real, someone who had learned to value authenticity over appearance. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the first drops of rain began to fall. They watched from the studio windows as the garden welcomed the shower, roses nodding under the gentle percussion. "Dance with me?" Michael asked suddenly. He moved to the record player she hadn't noticed in the corner. The familiar notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" filled the studio, but this time there were no cameras, no audience, no performance. As they moved together, Winter felt the difference in him. His arms held her gently but securely, his movements natural rather than practiced. This was the real Michael, the one she'd glimpsed in private moments during their first marriage, now living freely in the light. "I love you," he said softly against her hair, not as something to possess or display, but as someone to cherish and support. Someone who taught me the value of being genuine. Winter lifted her head to look at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "The real you. The one who builds houses and gardens, who remembers children's names and stories, who finally understands that love isn't measured in carats or captured in society photographs." Their kiss was nothing like the practiced moments of their first marriage. It was real, unplanned, perfect in its authenticity. When they parted, the rain had intensified outside, creating a cozy intimacy in the studio. "Move in with me," Michael said softly, "not because we're under contract or for any public reason. Move in because we've both learned how to be real, how to love genuinely, how to build something true together." Later that evening, as the rain continued its gentle symphony, they sat in the window seat of their studio. Winter's head rested against Michael's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. Her below in the garden, the roses he had planted swayed in the wind, not perfect hothouse blooms, but real flowers that had fought through adversity to bloom. "Tell me something real," Winter murmured, echoing their old game. Michael was quiet for a moment, his fingers playing with her hair. "I kept everything you left behind in the penthouse," he admitted. "Not the designer clothes or jewelry, I donated those. But the small things, your paperbacks with noted corners, the throw your neighbor knitted, the mug you used every morning, I couldn't let go of the real pieces of you." Outside, the rain began to ease, and a rainbow appeared over Cedar Grove. In the distance, the hospital where their new story had begun glowed softly in the emerging sunlight. Soon, children would come to this studio to create and heal, their laughter filling the spaces Michael had built with such care. But for now, in this quiet moment, as day turned to evening, two people who had found their way back to each other held on tight, knowing that their greatest adventure wasn't in grand gestures or public displays, but in the simple, profound act of being real together. Their story had come full circle, not to where it began, but to where it was always meant to be. In a house built by honest hands, In a love grown from genuine hearts, Winter and Michael had finally found their truth. That real love isn't something to show off. It's something to cherish quietly, completely, and forever. The end. Subscribe. If you loved,